Hey guys, Hamsterwheel here, and welcome back to the Showdown arena, a place where we let two classes with a certain spec go head to head in a DPS showdown to see who's better in this arena. Now in episode 1, the Fire Destruction Warlock dominated the Fire Mage, proving it is the King of Fire. But can it dominate a second time as a Shadow Destruction Warlock? Well, in this episode we're going to find out. And you guys voted on who should go up against the Shadow Destruction Warlock, and as it turns out, most people want to see a Shadow versus Shadow showdown, with the Priest trying to give the Warlock a run for its money. As always, we're going to check out the DPS in 4 different gear levels. Level 1 is just some random Burning Crusade blues. Level 2 is pre-raid best in slots, where we see the Frozen Shadow Weave and Spell Strike set. Level 3 is with some added tier 4 raiding gear thrown in there. And level 6 is the grand finale, which is tier 6 gear and epics out of Black Temple and Mount Hyjal. Just a reminder for the people that are new here, the DPS test will be done on a random raid boss that is perma-stunned, so I can safely do the rotations. Through some custom macros, I can give myself buffs and auras that you would normally have in a regular 25-man raiding environment, as well as debuffs on the target that would also be there. Think of the Warlock Curse, Shadow Weaving, Misery, Improved Scorch, and a bunch of other things. Then I will do 5 DPS tests with each gear level, and an average of those will determine the DPS of said class and said gear level. I'm doing multiple DPS tests per gear level, so the chance of me doing very high DPS because of just one DPS test where I got a lot of lucky crits is much lower. Alright, and without further ado, let's get acquainted with today's competitors. So starting off with the Shadow Destruction Warlock. Like the Fire Destruction Warlock, this way of speccing was a new way of raiding in the Burning Crusade, and this spec mainly focuses around shadow damage. It is a very popular choice in the Burning Crusade as it's super easy to master, the rotation is very simple, and it is set to stack really well with the more gear you have. All the Shadow Destruction Warlock will do is just spam Shadow Bolt and occasionally life tap, and that's it. But there is a good reason why this spec is so popular amongst raiding, and we're going to see how much damage it can do in this little DPS simulation. And today's challenger, the Shadow Priest, one that is actually viable in vanilla, but really only for their utility and not really for their pure DPS. In the Burning Crusade, however, they got some drastic changes, and they are a much better addition to any raid and can dish out much better DPS than they ever could. They are also much harder to master than the Shadow Destruction Warlock, as there are several dots and cooldown timers to keep track of. While the Warlock can just kick back and spam Shadow Bolt, Shadow Priests need to keep track of having Shadow Word Pain, Vampiric Embrace, and Vampiric Touch up at all times, and use Mind Blast, Shadow Word Death, and Mind Flay in between keeping those dots up. However, Mind Blast and Shadow Word Death both have a cooldown, so while you're tracking your dots, you have to try and balance your Mind Flays in between those two spells for an optimal rotation. It's definitely one of the more complex rotations for casters in the Burning Crusade, but that also means they are very engaging and fun to play. However, can they beat the Shadow Destruction Warlock? Well, let's find out. So as always, we're starting off with gear level 1. The Shadow Destruction Warlock in this gear did 945.6 DPS, and the Shadow Priest did 887.5 DPS. So it did come pretty close to the Shadow Destruction Warlock, mainly because in some random blues, the boss resisted a couple of spells, as opposed to the Priest who got a ton of resist reduction from talents, so the Shadow Priest was landing all its spells much more reliably. Still though, the round does go to the Warlock. Then we move on to gear level 2, where both casters get that sweet Frozen Shadow Weave and Spell Strike set. The Shadow Destruction Warlock got a really bump in DPS, and it dished out a solid 1412.1 DPS. However, the Shadow Priest also got a big gear upgrade. Can it match that sort of DPS though? Well, it did 1089.8 DPS. So unfortunately it can't, giving the Warlock a 2-0 lead. But we still have 2 more rounds left, so let's see if the Shadow Priest can push back. Moving on to round 3 with a couple of more epics out of tier 4 raids, and the Warlock did an impressive 1505.1 DPS. Not a huge bump in DPS, but still an increase, and on its own a very nice number. Can the Shadow Priest make this a 2-1, or will the Warlock continue its winning streak? Well, the Shadow Priest did 1164.2 DPS. Unfortunately, it really starts to fall behind the Warlock, and things aren't looking very good. But we still have our grand finale left, so let's see what it can do. And here we are at round 4. Now, as I said in the beginning, the Shadow Destruction spec for Warlock stacks really well with gear, and it shows in this round, because it did a massive 2246.4 DPS. A really nice number if you ask me, mainly because it landed some really big Shadow Bolt crits. However, does the Shadow Priest have what it takes to get at least 1 point in this showdown? Well, it did. 1397.2 DPS. Yep, not even close. While not the worst DPS ever, it simply cannot keep up with the huge amount of DPS the Warlock did in this round. So it appears the Warlock has won another round of our DPS showdown, and it did with total domination once more, winning all 4 rounds. However, I'd like to say a few things here. I know a fair amount of people knew the Shadow Destruction Warlock would dominate this showdown, as did I. But most people voted for Shadow Priest, and it was fun to see a little Shadow versus Shadow battle. And hey, the Shadow Priest did get pretty darn close to the Warlock in round 1, which also shows one thing. I know some people praise the Shadow Destruction Warlock spec for its superior DPS, but it's not always like that. Matter of fact, an equivalently geared Affliction Warlock or Demonology Warlock can, in blues and tier 4 gear, dish out more DPS than your average Shadow Bolt spamming Warlock. I know this out of my own experience and what I've seen in other raids. However, it can't be denied that from tier 5 and up, this spec really takes off, as Warlocks at that gear level can be hit capped and get a good amount of spell damage and crit to really dish out nasty Shadow Bolt crits and crit enough to keep that improved Shadow Bolt buff up at most times. Another thing to keep in mind is that, admittedly, the tier 6 gear for Warlocks was more beneficial than the tier 6 gear for Shadow Priest. So with some more off pieces rather than tier 6 gear, the Shadow Priest would do more DPS. However, even if the Shadow Priest had more off pieces, it simply would not have been able to match the DPS the Warlock did, so it would still not be able to win the last round. And as a bonus, let's see where our competitors stack up against our previous one, shall we? I decided to keep up a ranking system with some graphs, and a big thanks to Corporal Cuddles for suggesting the idea. In gear level 1, we currently have the Fire Destruction Warlock sitting at number 1 with a big lead over everyone else, already doing over 1200 DPS in nothing but some random blues. The Elemental Shaman is second, followed by the Fire Mage, who is third. In gear level 2, that is pre-raid best in slot, we also have the Firelock leading the pack with almost 1500 DPS. The second place goes to the Shadow Destruction Warlock, and third place goes to the Fire Mage. Then in gear level 3, that is pre-raid best in slot with the addition of some epics out of tier 4 raids, we have once again the Firelock leading the rest with almost 1600 DPS. The Shadow Destruction Warlock is once again second with over 1500 DPS, and third place goes to the Elemental Shaman with 1466.2 DPS. And then finally gear level 4, we have the Shadow Destruction Warlock who did way more DPS than anyone else with a whopping 2246.4 DPS, followed by the Fire Destruction Warlock who's just short of 2000 DPS, and third place goes to the Fire Mage with almost 1800 DPS. And well, the Warlock so far has absolutely crushed these showdowns with a total of 8 wins over other classes and specs. I have to remind you guys to take these DPS tests with a grain of salt, as this is my own simulated raid environment and not an actual one, so don't take this as gospel and don't expect the same results when actually raiding. So for now, the Warlock is the king of the Showdown arena. But in the near future, there is a class who's going to challenge the Warlock. A class that is considered to also be a very strong damage dealer in the Burning Crusade. Can it knock the Warlock off its throne, or will the Warlock continue to reign supreme? I guess you'll have to wait and see. For now though, I want to thank you for watching this video. I'm Hamsterwheel and have a good one.